The morning light from 3 different suns filtered through the massive crystal dome of Nexus Academy, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floors. Kim Dae-ho walked through the corridors, still amazed by the sight of so many different species moving together in one place. A group of insect-like Vexstar clicked past him, their metallic wings catching the light, while a family of rock-bodied granitians rolled slowly down the hallway, leaving tiny mineral deposits in their wake. Dae-ho had been at the academy for 2 months now, but he still felt like he was living in a dream. Back on Earth, his parents had been farmers in a small village outside Seoul. The idea that their son would one day study alongside beings from across the galaxy seemed impossible. Yet here he was, one of only 12 humans selected for the Galactic exchange program. The acceptance letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning. It's delivered by a small floating drone that had materialized in their kitchen. His mother had nearly fainted when the holographic message began playing, showing a dignified alien figure explaining that Kim Dae-ho had been chosen based on his exceptional grades in biology and his psychological profile indicating strong adaptability. Now, as he entered Xenobiology Lab 7, Dae-ho reflected on how different his life had become. The laboratory itself was a marvel of engineering, the atmospheric control systems that could accommodate dozens of different species simultaneously. The walls were lined with containment units holding specimens from worlds he had never imagined could exist. Lee Sora was already at their shared workstation, her black hair tied back in a practical ponytail as she organized her digital notes. Looked up as he approached, offering a small smile that reminded him of home. Sora came from Busan and had been studying marine biology before the program selected her. They had bonded over their shared confusion during the first week. When neither of them could figure out how to operate the zero-gravity bathroom facilities. "You're cutting it close again," she said in Korean, keeping her voice low. They had learned that many of their classmates had sensitive hearing, got lost watching the ethereal students practice their light singing, Dae-ho admitted, settling into his seat. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" "Eh?" Sora shook her head, but her expression was understanding. Even after 2 months, they both still found themselves constantly amazed by the diversity of life in the galaxy. Earth had seemed so full of variety before, but compared to what they saw here daily, their home planet felt almost monotonous. The other students were filing in now, each moving to their designated atmospheric zones. Dae-ho watched as 3 wealthy students gracefully lowered themselves into their nutrient tanks, their root-like feet immediately beginning to absorb the mineral-rich solution. Their skin had a translucent quality that reminded him of jade, and they communicated through subtle color changes that ran along their bark-like arms. Near the back of the lab, a cluster of Kurani floated in their environmental suits, their jellyfish-like bodies pulsing with soft blues and purples. They were among the most peaceful species Dae-ho had ever encountered, and their bioluminescent communication was so beautiful it was almost hypnotic to watch. The door hissed open and Professor Havrick entered, his forearms carrying various pieces of equipment. The Zentarian moved with the quick, efficient motions of someone accustomed to managing multiple tasks simultaneously. His compound eyes could focus on different parts of the room at once, making him an excellent teacher. For such a diverse group, "Settle in, everyone," Professor Havrick announced, his voice carrying the slight buzzing undertone common to his species. "Today we begin our study of apex predators, starting with one of the most dangerous creatures known to galactic science." Nervous ripple went through the class. Even the usually calm, wealthy students shifted in their tanks, their skin taking on slightly darker hues. Dae-ho noticed that several of the smaller species, including the mouse-like Piperi, had instinctively moved closer to their larger classmates. Professor Havrick activated the central holographic projector, and the lights dimmed automatically. "The Corvin Night Stalker," he began, his tone taking on the careful cadence of someone discussing something genuinely dangerous, "represents the pinnacle of predatory evolution. Native to Corvosavin, a world where the survival rate for most species is less than 30%. Dae-ho felt Sora tense beside him. They'd both done additional reading about Deathworlds, curious about how their own planet compared to others. In the galaxy, Earth, they had learned, was classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, meaning it was considered extremely hostile to most galactic life. Only a handful of species had evolved on worlds more dangerous than theirs. This creature has never been successfully contained alive, Professor Haverick continued, beginning to input commands into the holographic system. Every attempt has resulted in catastrophic failure and significant loss of life. We study it only through remote observation and archaeological remains. The hologram began to form, starting as a vague outline before solidifying into a creature that made several students gasp audibly. The Corvin Night Stalker was sleek and predatory, with 6 powerful legs that ended in claws that looked like they could cut through starship hull plating. Its head was elongated, filled with rows of serrated teeth that seemed designed for maximum damage. But what struck Deho most was how familiar it seemed. Not in appearance, but in the way it moved. The way it held itself. It reminded him of the large predators he had seen in documentaries about Earth's history. The ones that had shaped humanity's evolution through millions of years of being prey. Now, the creature's hunting pattern is particularly sophisticated, Professor Haverick explained, manipulating the hologram to show the Night Stalker in various poses. It uses pack tactics, environmental manipulation, what can only be described as psychological warfare against its prey. A Pippery student raised a tiny paw. Professor, how do the inhabitants of Corvasavan survive with such creatures? Professor Haverick's compound eyes focused on the small mammalian student. They don't. Corvasavan has no native intelligent species. The Night Stalkers are the sole apex predators, and they have eliminated all competition. The class fell silent, absorbing this information. Deho found himself studying the hologram more carefully, noting the creature's muscle structure, the way its joints moved, the positioning of its sensory organs. It was clearly built for speed and power, but he also noticed potential weaknesses, blind spots that could be exploited. For civilized species, Professor Haverick continued, direct confrontation with such a creature is not just inadvisable, it's literally impossible. Our evolution has not equipped us with the necessary survival instincts. Deho caught Sora's eye and saw his own thoughts reflected there. They both remembered their grandfather's stories about surviving the Korean War, about facing wild boars in the mountains, about the constant awareness that had kept their ancestors alive in a world full of predators. Tomorrow, Professor Haverick announced, we will study the creature's hunting behavior through simulation. Remember to review your safety protocols. Even holographic representations can cause psychological trauma in sensitive species. As the class began to disperse, Deho lingered, still studying the frozen hologram. The Night Stalker was dangerous, certainly, but it was also just an animal. And humans had been dealing with dangerous animals for their entire evolutionary history. Sora appeared beside him, her voice thoughtful. It's different from the others, isn't it? What do you mean? The way they talk about it. The other creatures we've studied, they treat them like scientific specimens. But this one, they're afraid of it. Deho nodded slowly. Maybe that's because they've never had to deal with anything like it. We have. As they left the laboratory, neither of them could have imagined that tomorrow's safe simulation would become anything but safe, and that their human heritage would be put to the ultimate test. The morning had started like any other in Xenobiology Lab 7. Professor Haverick was explaining the feeding patterns of the Corvin Night Stalker when the first tremor hit. It was subtle. At first, just a gentle vibration through the floor that made the holographic display flicker slightly. Most students didn't even notice it. Deho felt it immediately. Growing up in a seismically active region of Korea had given him an instinctive awareness of ground movement. But this wasn't an earthquake. The vibration had a mechanical quality, like heavy machinery operating somewhere deep in the building's infrastructure. Sora glanced at him questioningly. She had felt it too, her hand instinctively gripping the edge of their workstation. Around them, their alien classmates continued taking notes, their various forms of sensory perception apparently not registering. The subtle warning signs, the second tremor, was stronger. This time, several of the atmospheric tanks containing the Velthy students rippled visibly, causing the plant-like beings to sway with concern. The Karani floating near the ceiling began pulsing with uncertain amber lights, their usual peaceful blue dimming to worried orange. Professor Havrick paused mid-sentence, his compound eyes scanning the room with growing alarm. His 4 arms moved to different control panels simultaneously, checking the laboratory's various systems. "That's unusual," he muttered, more to himself than to the class. The third tremor wasn't subtle at all. It shook the entire laboratory, with enough force to rattle equipment and cause several students to grab onto their desks for stability. The holographic Night Stalker wavered and distorted, its fearsome image becoming pixelated and unstable. Then the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing everything in harsh red illumination. The sudden change from the laboratory's usual soft white lighting to the blood-colored emergency system created an immediate atmosphere of danger. Several of the more sensitive species began showing signs of distress. The facility's AI voice echoed through the intercom system, its usually calm tones now carrying an edge of urgency. "Attention all personnel. Containment systems are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain in your current locations while maintenance teams investigate." Deo's military training from his mandatory service kicked in. The phrasing was all wrong. Technical difficulties was bureaucratic speak for something much worse. His eyes swept the room, automatically cataloging exit routes and potential defensive positions. The AI spoke again, this time with unmistakable alarm. "Containment breach in Sublevel 5. All students and faculty implement emergency protocols immediately." Professor Havrick's normally steady demeanor cracked. His forearms began moving frantically across multiple control panels, trying to activate the laboratory's security systems. "This can't be happening," he whispered, his compound eyes reflecting the red emergency lights. "The containment systems are supposed to be fail-safe." A new sound joined the alarms, a low rhythmic pounding that seemed to be getting closer. It reminded Deho of construction work, but there was something organic about the rhythm. Like a massive heartbeat echoing through the building's structure, Sora moved closer to him, her voice barely audible over the alarms. "That sound, ... it's not machinery, is it?" Before Deho could answer, the pounding stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. In that quiet moment, every student in the laboratory held their breath, waiting for something they couldn't name. The explosion that followed shattered that silence like glass. It came from somewhere below them, a deep, resonant boom that sent shockwaves through the building's foundation. The emergency lights flickered. Several pieces of equipment fell from their mounting brackets. Professor Havrick's voice cracked as he tried to maintain order. "Everyone, please remain calm. The security teams are responding to the situation." But even as he spoke, his own actions betrayed his fear. All 4 of his arms were now working desperately at different control panels, trying to seal the laboratory and establish communication with the outside. The fact that he wasn't succeeding was becoming increasingly obvious. The AI's voice returned, but this time it carried a note of genuine panic that sent chills through every student present. "Containment breach in Lab 7. Live specimen has escaped. Holding chamber. All personnel evacuate immediately." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Several of the smaller species immediately fainted, their unconscious forms dropping to the floor with soft thuds. The wealthy students began releasing distress pheromones, filling their atmospheric tanks with chemical signals that made the air itself smell of fear. The holographic Night Stalker, which had been flickering throughout the emergency, suddenly stabilized and then vanished completely. The projector shut down with a quiet click that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. That's when they heard it. A new sound that made everyone's blood freeze. It was a scraping noise, like metal, being dragged across stone, coming from the corridor outside their laboratory. But underneath that was something else, something that sounded disturbingly like breathing. Heavy, predatory breathing. Professor Havrick stumbled backward from his control panels, his forearms shaking visibly. "The hologram," he whispered, his voice barely audible. It wasn't just a projection. It had a real one, a live specimen for advanced research. The scraping sound grew louder, accompanied now by what could only be described as sniffing. Something large was moving in the corridor outside. It was clearly searching for something. The reinforced laboratory doors, designed to contain atmospheric pressure and prevent contamination, suddenly looked terrifyingly inadequate. They were built to keep air in and students safe from academic accidents, not to keep out apex predators. Sora grabbed Deho's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "What do we do?" she whispered, her usual calm completely shattered. But Deho was already moving, his mind shifting into a mode that his alien classmates couldn't comprehend. While they froze in terror or fled in panic, his human instincts were doing something else entirely. They were preparing to fight. His eyes swept the laboratory, no longer seeing it as a place of learning, but as a battlefield. The heavy workstations could provide cover. The chemical storage units might contain useful materials. Emergency equipment could be weaponized. The scraping sound stopped directly outside their door. In the sudden silence, everyone could hear their own heartbeats. The Karani had dimmed their lights to almost nothing, trying to hide. The remaining conscious students pressed themselves against the far wall, as far from the door as possible. Then came a sound that would haunt their dreams for years to come. A low, rumbling growl that spoke of intelligence, hunger, and deadly intent. Whatever was outside wasn't just a mindless predator. It was thinking, planning, hunting the door. 3 inches of reinforced polymer designed to withstand tremendous pressure began to buckle inward. Something on the other side was testing its strength. The reinforced door finally gave way with a deep, screaming sound of twisted metal. The Corvin Night Stalker burst through the opening like a force of nature unleashed, its massive black form filling the doorway completely. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying than the hologram had suggested. Its hide wasn't just black, it seemed to absorb light, creating an aura of darkness around its body that made it difficult to track with the eyes. The beast's 6 legs moved with perfect coordination as it entered the laboratory, each crystalline claw clicking against the floor with surgical precision. Its head swiveled back and forth, taking in the room's layout with predatory intelligence. 6 eyes, arranged in pairs along its elongated skull, glowed with a sickly yellow light that cut through the red emergency illumination. The moment the creature appeared, chaos erupted throughout the laboratory. The remaining Karani students tried to float higher toward the ceiling, their bioluminescent bodies flashing in rapid panic signals that filled the air with strobing light. The Velthi in their tanks began thrashing, their root systems tangling, as they tried to somehow burrow deeper into their nutrient solutions. Professor Havrick backed against the far wall, all 4 of his arms pressed flat against the surface, as if he could somehow phase through it. His compound eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the Night Stalker's glow in dozens of tiny fragments. The Night Stalker's head turned toward a cluster of Maisel students who had pressed themselves into the corner near the specimen storage units. The Maisel were small fungoid creatures about the size of human children, with soft, spore-producing bodies that marked them as easy prey. Their usual gentle luminescence had completely faded, leaving them nearly invisible in the shadows. But their fear scent was unmistakable. The predator began stalking toward them with deliberate slowness, savoring the hunt. Each step was calculated, designed to build terror in its prey. This wasn't just feeding behavior. This was psychological warfare refined over millions of years of evolution. One of the Maisel students, a young female named Sprilla, whom Deho had helped with her atmospheric chemistry homework, whimpered softly. The sound seemed to trigger something in the Night Stalker's brain. Its pace quickened slightly. That's when something inside Deho snapped into focus. He had grown up in the mountains outside Seoul, where his grandfather had taught him to hunt wild boar. He remembered the old man's words. A cornered animal is dangerous, but a hunting animal is predictable. They follow patterns, find the pattern, exploit the weakness, without conscious thought. Deho stepped forward and grabbed the nearest heavy object. A metal analysis stool designed to support equipment weighing several hundred kilograms. The weight felt comfortable in his hands, familiar in a way that surprised him. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the ambient terror like a knife. "Over here, ugly?" The Night Stalker's head snapped toward him with lightning speed. All 6 eyes focused on this bipedal creature that had just done something unprecedented in the predator's experience, instead of running or hiding. A challenge. For a moment, Predator and human stared at each other across the length of the laboratory. Deho could feel his heartbeat slow and steady, the way it always did when he was completely focused. His grandfather had called it hunter's calm, the state where fear transformed into clarity. The Night Stalker's confusion lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then it launched itself forward with explosive speed, covering the distance between them in a single bound. Its claws extended fully, designed to rake through flesh and bone like paper. Deho waited until the last possible moment, then sidestepped with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years practicing taekwondo. The creature's momentum carried it past him, and he brought the heavy stool down hard on its rear leg with all the force he could muster. The impact rang through the laboratory like a bell, the vibration traveling up through the metal and into Deho's arms. The Night Stalker stumbled slightly but recovered almost immediately, spinning with impossible agility to face him again. This time, its attack was more calculated. Instead of charging straight forward, it feinted left and then slashed with its right side claws. Trying to anticipate Deho's evasion, the claws missed his face by less than an inch. Close enough that he could feel the air displacement. One talon caught his shirt sleeve, shredding the fabric but missing skin. Deho rolled backward, using his momentum to carry him behind one of the heavy lab tables. His mind was racing now, cataloging everything he had observed about the creatures. Movement patterns. It favored its right side slightly. Its six-legged stance made it stable, but also predictable when turning. Most importantly, its eyes were positioned for forward tracking. It had blind spots on its sides and rear. The Night Stalker leaped onto the lab table, its claws finding purchase on the metal surface with ease. It towered above Deho now, preparing to drop down for a killing strike. That's when Deho spotted the liquid nitrogen storage unit built into the wall behind him. Emergency coolant for the specimen preservation systems, stored under pressure in a tank designed for easy access during equipment maintenance. As the Night Stalker launched itself downward, claws extended, Deho rolled to his left and yanked the emergency release valve. A stream of supercooled nitrogen shot out under tremendous pressure, catching the creature full in the face as it landed. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Night Stalker shrieked, a sound like tearing metal that hurt the ears of every being in the laboratory. It stumbled backward, pawing at its face with its front claws, temporarily blinded by the sudden temperature change. "Sora," Deho shouted without taking his eyes off the creature. "Get everyone to the emergency exit. Move now." His voice carried an authority that cut through the panic. Swara, who had been frozen by the sight of the confrontation, suddenly snapped into action. She began herding the terrified students toward the laboratory's rear exit, speaking rapidly in multiple languages as she tried to communicate with different species. The alien students moved like they were in a dream. To process what they were witnessing, this human, this supposedly fragile creature from a backwater world, was actually fighting an apex predator and surviving. More than surviving, he was holding his own. Professor Havrick, still pressed against the wall, stared at Deho with compound eyes that reflected a mixture of terror and awe. In all his years studying dangerous fauna, he had never seen anything like this. Civilized species simply didn't behave this way. They used technology, weapons, environmental suits. They didn't face apex predators with improvised tools and raw courage. The Night Stalker's vision was clearing now, and its rage had increased exponentially. This wasn't just hunting anymore, this was personal. No prey had ever fought back this effectively. The creature's predatory pride was wounded. It began circling Deho with renewed caution, its 6 eyes never leaving him as it looked for an opening. The playful, cat-like stalking was gone now, replaced by the focused intensity of a predator that recognized it was facing something unexpected. Deho kept the lab table between himself and the creature, moving in a counter-circle that maintained distance while keeping his options open. His breathing was controlled, his movements economical. Every step was calculated, every gesture purposeful. Behind him, he could hear Sora successfully evacuating. The last of the students, their alien classmates, were finally moving, gut-driven by a combination of terror and amazement that left them functional but speechless. The Night Stalker crouched low, preparing for another attack. This time, Deho knew it wouldn't underestimate him. The real fight was about to begin. The liquid nitrogen had given Deho a temporary advantage, but he knew it wouldn't last long. The Night Stalker's vision was already clearing, and the creature's rage had transformed from simple, predatory instinct into something far more dangerous: personal vendetta. No prey had ever dared to fight back, and the beast's primitive brain was struggling to process this new reality. The creature began moving differently now, abandoning its earlier stalking behavior for something more systematic and terrifying. Instead of focusing solely on Deho, it started destroying everything in the laboratory with methodical precision. Its crystalline claws raked across workstations, sending expensive equipment crashing to the floor. Specimen containers exploded in showers of glass and preservative fluid. Deho realized what was happening. The Night Stalker was eliminating his cover and weapons, Arcaners forcing him into an open confrontation where its superior size and natural armaments would guarantee victory. It was a hunting strategy that spoke of frightening intelligence. "Clever girl," Deho muttered under his breath in Korean, remembering an old movie his father had shown him about dinosaurs. The parallel wasn't lost on him. He was essentially fighting a highly evolved, killing machine that had perfected its craft over millions of years. The creature methodically destroyed the lab table he had been using for cover, its claws reducing the heavy metal surface to twisted scrap in seconds. Then it turned toward the atmospheric control systems where the remaining Velthi students were still trapped in their nutrient tanks, unable to evacuate. That's when Deho made his next move. Instead of trying to stay away from the creature, he deliberately moved closer, sliding along the wall toward the main power distribution panel. The Night Stalker's 6 eyes tracked his movement, but it continued its systematic destruction. It's confident that it was hurting its prey exactly where it wanted. The beast was wrong. Deho reached the power panel just as the Night Stalker finished, destroying the last of the major lab equipment. The creature turned toward him with predatory satisfaction, clearly believing it had eliminated all variables from the equation. But Deho had grown up in a household where his father worked as an electrician, and he had spent countless hours learning about power systems and electrical safety. More importantly, he understood something about the laboratory that the Night Stalker couldn't possibly know. It was designed with multiple backup systems and emergency protocols. As the creature charged toward him, Deho yanked open the emergency power panel and grabbed the manual release for the compressed gas storage system. The laboratory used pressurized atmospheric mixtures to maintain perfect environmental conditions for different species, and those gases were stored in high-pressure cylinders along the far wall. The Night Stalker was halfway across the room when Deho triggered the emergency release. The effect was immediate and devastating. A dozen high-pressure cylinders vented simultaneously, creating an explosive decompression that sent the creature tumbling through the air like a leaf in a hurricane. It crashed into the far wall with enough force to crack the reinforced polymer surface, leaving deep gouges where its claws scraped for purchase. But Deho wasn't finished. While the creature was still disoriented from the blast, he grabbed a handful of power cables from the destroyed equipment around him. These weren't ordinary cables. They were designed to carry massive electrical loads for the laboratory's advanced systems. It's made from reinforced materials that could handle extreme stress, moving with the speed and precision of someone who had spent years practicing martial arts. Deho darted behind the stunned Night Stalker and began wrapping the cables around its rear legs. The creature thrashed wildly, but its position against the wall limited its mobility. Each time the beast tried to turn and attack him, Deho used its own momentum against it, allowing the creature's struggles to pull the cables tighter. Like watching a master craftsman at work, using physics and leverage instead of brute force. From the observation window above the laboratory, Professor Haverick watched in stunned silence. He had taken shelter there when the evacuation began, along with several other faculty members who had been monitoring the situation. What they were witnessing defied everything they understood about civilized behavior. "Impossible," Professor Haverick whispered, his compound eyes reflecting the chaos below. No civilized being could face such a creature and survive. The psychological trauma alone should have rendered him catatonic. Dr. Yelenara, the Academy's head of xenopsychology, stood beside him with her sensor equipment recording everything. Her crystalline form was vibrating with excitement as she gathered data on human behavior under extreme stress. "Professor," she said, her voice carrying harmonic undertones of amazement, "I don't think you understand what we're seeing. This isn't survival behavior. This is predatory behavior. The human isn't trying to escape. He's hunting the Night Stalker." Below them, Deho had successfully restrained the creature's rear legs and was now working on its middle set of limbs. The Night Stalker's struggles were becoming more frantic, but also more ineffective as the cables tightened with each movement. Sora appeared at the emergency exit. Having successfully evacuated the last of their classmates, she called back to Deho with a mixture of pride and concern in her voice. "Security teams are almost here. Evacuation is complete." Deho dodged another swipe from the creature's front claws, which were still free and extremely dangerous. "Good," called back, his voice carrying an almost casual tone that sent shivers through the watching aliens. "I'm running out of furniture to throw at this thing." The casualness of his response while facing mortal danger was perhaps the most shocking thing of all. He wasn't panicking, wasn't showing signs of the psychological breakdown that should have overwhelmed any civilized being in such a situation. Instead, he was displaying what could only be described as professional competence. Dr. Yelinar's instruments were recording unprecedented data. His stress hormones are elevated but within normal parameters for focused activity. His neural patterns show heightened awareness, but not panic. "Professor, this human is actually enjoying this." The revelation hit the watching faculty like a physical blow. The idea that any sentient being could find pleasure in combat with an apex predator was so alien to their experience that it challenged their fundamental understanding of intelligent life. On the laboratory floor, Deho continued his methodical work. He had noticed that the Night Stalker's struggles were creating a rhythm, and he was using that rhythm against it. Each time the creature pulled in one direction, he would add another loop of cable in the opposite direction. It was a technique his grandfather had taught him for securing wild boar, adapted for a creature many times larger and infinitely more dangerous. The principle remained the same. Let the animal's own strength work against it. The Night Stalker's front claws were still free, and it managed to catch Deho's shoulder with one swipe, tearing through his shirt and leaving 3 parallel scratches across his back. The pain was sharp and immediate, but instead of slowing him down, it seemed to focus his concentration even more. Blood from the scratches stained his torn shirt, but Deho barely seemed to notice. He was completely absorbed in the tactical problem before him, treating the deadly predator like a particularly challenging puzzle to be solved. The watching aliens could barely comprehend what they were seeing. This human had just been wounded by one of the galaxy's most feared predators, and his response was to become more efficient, not less. In the distance, they could hear the sound of approaching security teams' heavy boots in the corridors, the whine of energy weapons charging, the efficient chatter of trained professionals responding to a crisis. But as they watched, Deho had the final restraints to the Night Stalker's front limbs. They realized that the security teams might not be needed for rescue. They might be needed for cleanup. The sound of heavy boots echoing through the corridors announced the arrival of the security teams long before they reached the laboratory. Deho could hear multiple species moving together, the sharp clicks of Zentarian claws, the heavy thuds of armored Korgan boots, and the whisper-soft movement of ethereal peacekeepers floating just above the ground. When the reinforced emergency doors finally opened, what the security team found defied every protocol they had trained for. Instead of a scene of carnage, they discovered the Corvan Night Stalker completely immobilized in an intricate web of power cables and restraints. The creature was still alive, still breathing, but utterly helpless, and sitting calmly on a lab stool nearby, slightly out of breath, but otherwise appearing completely normal, was Kim Deho. He was using his torn shirt to wipe blood from the scratches on his shoulder, his expression more annoyed than traumatized. Security Chief Vexstar, a battle-scarred veteran who had seen combat across 3 star systems, stopped dead in his tracks. His crystalline exoskeleton shifted through several colors as his emotional processors struggled to interpret what he was seeing. "How did you? Began. then stopped, his translator struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in his language. How is this possible? Deho looked up from examining his wounds and shrugged with the casual gesture that was already becoming famous throughout the academy. It's just a big predator. They're not that different from the animals back home. The silence that followed. His words stretched uncomfortably long. The security team exchanged glances that needed no translation. They were looking at something unprecedented in galactic history. Officer Krellanaya, a towering Korgan whose species was considered among the more physically capable in the galaxy, approached the restrained Night Stalker with obvious caution. Even secured as it was, the creature represented death incarnate to most civilized beings. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the deep harmonics of her kind, "we need to understand what happened here. Our sensors detected combat signatures that should have been impossible for an unarmored civilian." Before Deho could answer, Professor Havrick emerged from the observation deck where he had taken shelter. The Zentarian's forearms were shaking visibly as he approached, his compound eyes fixed on Deho with a mixture of awe and something that looked disturbingly like fear. "Your homeworld," Professor Havrick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Earth... What kind of place creates beings like you?" Sora, who had been helping tend to the traumatized students in the hallway, returned in time to hear the question. She looked at her friend with pride mixed with amusement. "A place where everything wants to eat you," she answered, her smile. Carrying the confidence of someone who had grown up on the same impossible world, we humans learn to adapt. The simple statement sent ripples of unease through the assembled aliens. They had read the files on Earth, knew its classification as a Class 12 death world. But the reality of what that meant was only now becoming clear. Within hours, news of the incident had spread throughout Nexus Academy like wildfire. Students who had never paid attention to the human exchange program suddenly found themselves fascinated by these mysterious Deathworlders. The cafeteria fell silent whenever Deho or Sora entered, hundreds of alien eyes tracking their every movement by. The end of the week, the story had reached the Galactic News Network. Reporter Zelandria, an elegant ethereal being whose species was known for their delicate beauty and refined sensibilities, arrived at the Academy to conduct what she assumed would be a routine interview about an unusual animal attack. Instead, she found herself face to face with something her sophisticated civilization had never encountered, a being who treated mortal danger as a minor inconvenience. "Mr. Kim," she began, her voice carrying the melodious tones that made ethereals such popular broadcasters. "The entire galaxy is talking about your confrontation with the Night Stalker. How does it feel to become famous overnight?" Deho, uncomfortable, with the attention, as always, shifted in his seat before answering. "I just did what anyone would do. The creature was threatening my classmates." Zelandria's ethereal form flickered with confusion. Her species communicated partially through energy patterns. And Deho's casual dismissal of his actions was creating readings she had never seen before. "But surely you understand the magnitude of what you accomplished," she pressed. "You single-handedly defeated a creature that has terrified civilized species for millennia." "I didn't defeat it," Deho corrected. "I just kept it busy until help arrived." The distinction was lost on most of the galaxy, but it said everything about human psychology, where other species saw an impossible victory against overwhelming odds. Deho saw successful time management. "But weren't you afraid?" Zelandria asked. The question that had been burning in every alien mind since the incident. For the first time, Deho paused thoughtfully before answering. "Of course I was afraid. Fear keeps you alive. But fear doesn't mean you stop moving forward." The interview was broadcast across 1,000 worlds, and that single statement became a defining moment in galactic understanding of human nature. Fear, as a tool rather than a limitation, was a concept so alien to most species that entire universities began studying the psychological implications. The changes at Nexus Academy were immediate and profound. Human exchange students found themselves treated with a new kind of respect that bordered on reverence. Other species began requesting them as lab partners, not for their academic abilities, but for the security their presence provided. The incident also triggered a complete review of how Deathworld species were classified and integrated into galactic society. If humans could face apex predators as a matter of routine, what other capabilities did they possess that had been overlooked? Dr. Yelenara's psychological analysis of the event became required reading in xenobiology programs across the galaxy. Her conclusion was both simple and terrifying. Humans didn't just survive their hostile world through luck or technology. They had evolved to thrive in conditions that would destroy most other forms of life. Weeks passed, and life at the academy slowly returned to normal, though normal now had a different meaning. Deho went back to his studies, still helping classmates with their homework and participating in study groups.
Ow.
But there was an unspoken understanding that the fragile human from the backwater planet was perhaps the most dangerous being in any room he entered, so Dashra watched her friend navigate his new reality with typical human adaptability. To the galaxy, Kim Dae-ho had become a legend, a symbol of humanity's unique place in the cosmic community. To her, he was still just the boy from the Korean mountains, who had learned to face wild boars with his grandfather. The Korvan Night Stalker, safely contained in a new facility with security measures designed specifically to prevent another escape, became an unwitting ambassador for human capabilities. Every xenobiology student who studied it was reminded that, somewhere, in the galaxy was a species that could face such creatures and win. But perhaps the most significant change was in how humans saw themselves. The incident had shown the galaxy what they were capable of, but it had also shown humans that their seemingly ordinary survival skills were actually extraordinary gifts. As Daeho sat in his dormitory room one evening, video calling his parents back on Earth, he tried to explain what had happened without worrying them too much. "So you fought a big animal at school?" his mother asked, her face creased with concern on the screen. "Something like that, Mom. It was no big deal." His father, practical as always, had a different question. "Did you remember what Grandfather taught you about staying calm?" asked Dad. "His lessons probably saved my life." But Daeho didn't tell them was that his grandfather's simple wisdom about hunting wild boar had given humanity a new reputation among the stars. They weren't just another species anymore. They were the ones who refused to back down when others needed protection. And in a galaxy full of wonders and terrors that made all the difference, the END